I'm standing on Lambay Hill, overlooking Sutton Harbour. You get a lovely view here, looking across Sutton Harbour to Captown on the other side. Our story starts in what is today Drake Circus and ends across the water here at Captown. His household consisted of his wife Elizabeth, his daughter Mary, who had just recently been widowed and came home with her infant, and two home helps, 15-year-old Anne Evans and an older lady, Philippa Carey. William Weeks was a very successful Plymouth businessman. He lived in a rather nice house, which would be more or less on the plot of what is today Drake Circus, which we have here. It was a grand house, and in Plymouth of the 17th century, he could have looked out of his windows and probably looked down to Sutton Harbour, which is down here. He'd have seen the sea. As I said, he was very successful. He'd been Lord Mayor, Justice of the Peace, but his main business was in the clothing industry. Going up the hill towards Mutley Plain, back in the days of 1675 or thereabouts, it was open fields. He used those open fields and the fact that it was very close to the main water supply to the town of Plymouth to run a very successful dyeing business. The water supply was to make the dye, and the open fields would be to dry the clothing in afterwards. With a fine house at Drake Circus, as it is today, not far away, he would have needed a water supply. And the water supply back in the day would have been not far from here, but probably somewhere over there in Andrew's Well. The staff who worked for William Weeks would have made regular trips along this way to bring water back to the house. It's quite interesting to think what Plymouth would have been like in 1675. The Civil War was over. Charles I was beheaded. Oliver Cromwell had gone. And above all, Charles II had come back. I could well be here, almost in the footsteps of Anne Evans, who'd been down to St Andrew's Well to collect the water and bring it back to the house, if we are correct in thinking it was within the plot of what we call Drake Circus today. In the mid to late 17th century, walking along here now, and that's not exactly here because of course we're on elevated land, but in the general geographic area of that era, 1675, we would be almost on the beach area, or not far away, of Sutton Harbour. In fact, many of you will remember when the bus station was here, and if I stood here and just looked this way, I would see almost down to Sutton Harbour. But of course that was before this happened.
This was in the days of the Civil War, right here in this area, the police station, where the police station now stands, opposite Charles Church, was an earthwork called Fort Charles. That was here in the Civil War. It's one of the smaller earthworks on the interior line. A stone wall surrounded it, and there was gun platforms. At the time of the 1670s, this was now beginning to collapse. People were taking stone off it and using it to build their own homes.
But it would still be there, wouldn't it?
Yes. It would be, most of it would still be there, because it's only 20, 30 years after the Civil War. So most of the fort would remain, But over the next decade or so, people really took the stone because buildings went up everywhere. And they even probably used parts of it to repair the church occasionally. Right, Steve, we've just left Plymouth, the hustle and bustle of the old town in the 1640s. After the Civil War, I've come out of North Gate, or Old Town Gate as it's known as well, and we are walking up Tavistock Road towards North Hill, which in those days was much, much steeper. So it's quite a slog to get up there. In those days, the Civil War days, to your left would have been Fort Charles. I'm just giving you an idea where you are.
There.
To that direction.
Down there.
And to the right, just in that direction, going towards Sutton Harbour, was where the North Gate, or Old Town Gate, was in those days of the Civil War.
And that was a very important way in and out of the town, wasn't it?
It was the main North Road out to Plymouth, towards Tavistock. That's why it was called Tavistock Road in later years. And North Hill, which, as I said, was much, much steeper in those days. And if you'd have looked up here in those days, none of this buildings would have been here. It would have been open green land, and you would have seen the Magdalen Fort, the remains of the Magdalen Fort, which were abandoned after the Civil War and stood there for around 200 years.
And William Weeks' factory would be somewhere up here.
Yeah, somewhere up here. We don't know where.
Let's have a look. No open countryside today. A vibrant, modern, educational facility. What would William Weeks think of it today?
I'm just where the university is now, in the middle between the university and the museum, Plymouth City Museum. If you'd have looked in this direction in the days of the Civil War, just after, all you would have seen in this direction was open countryside. All you would have seen up here is open countryside. All you would have seen in that direction is countryside. Not so open on this side. There were more houses starting to go up. People were building their little cottages, and there was industry starting up here. Wherever this water course came down, which was the Leat, because in the old days, Sir Francis Drake had his mills up here near Sherwell Church, what is now Sherwell Church. So after the Civil War, industry would have been coming up along here, tanning places for leather. There'd be other industry. People would be taking goods up towards Mutley Plain or going towards Tavistock in this direction. Right, I've come part of the way up North Hill. I've still got a long way to go. I'm standing at the water conduit that was not here in the days of the Civil War. It was down on the Barbican. In this area with the water supply behind us is where Mr. Weeks had his dyeing factory.
Here we have Drake's Reservoir today.
Yeah.
And the fountains are working. I thought those of you who no longer live here in Plymouth would like to see this. Phil, tell us all about Plymouth in the 1670s, several years after the end of the Civil War, when we'd be sitting here in countryside, almost. What would it have been like?
Well, after the Civil War, Steve, it took Plymouth quite a while, a few years to recover. The trade had been sort of suppressed. A lot of people had lost members of their families. There were a lot of beggars on the street, women and children, and wounded soldiers, because in those days you never got any pension or any money from the state. And Cromwell's regime, which came in after Charles I was executed after the Second Civil War, then they started with the pensions, but until that time you would have had a lot of beggars. And the Puritan way of life was very strict. You had to adhere to their policies. Christmas was banned by Parliament. Certain music was banned in churches. Theatres were banned. You had to attend services, church service. If you were up on the Hoe, and there was a church service on the Sunday, you could be fined. You could be arrested and fined for that. If you were drinking, you could be fined. At the Restoration, things changed. Charles II came back, brought back theatre, brought back music, brought back excitement, really, because the years of the Puritans were quite dark and dismal. So after the war, Charles II came back, things changed. In Plymouth, the population started to increase in the mid-70s, early 70s, mid-70s, because of the wars with the Dutch. There was war with Holland between 1664 and 1667, and it brought business to Plymouth, if you like. The ships were here, more ships were brought here. So anything associated with ships would come to Plymouth and open up. Mid-70s, a man called Cosimo di Medici came from Italy on his way to Charles's court in London. And he stopped off and he looked around Plymouth. He didn't stay long because he was waiting for a coach to take him on the final part of his journey to London. And he said at the time, Plymouth was one of the best cities in the kingdom. He'd only been to Plymouth, mind you, but he said Plymouth was one of the best cities and the population was between 12 and 15,000. That's an exaggeration, more like 10,000. They were coming up to 10,000, especially after the war losses. So Plymouth was quite an up-and-coming town in those days. Right, Steve, I'm now down on where Drake's elite would have come. But it wouldn't have looked like this. It was just an earthen channel. And Drake's mills were near this spot. And he had a 67-year lease on these mills. And the water would turn the wheels and get his corn mills going. Now, this gives you an idea of why people would use this area to build their businesses in here. Mr. Weeks would have had his dyeing company, or his firm, his factory, close to this water source, because nobody wants to go and pick up water. It's easier if the water's right there. And in the Civil War, the Royalists managed to cut the leat out on Dartmoor somewhere, we're not sure where. They managed to cut off the leats, the water supply. They thought that this would make Plymouth suffer, but we had our own supply of water from a number of wells in the city, or in the town as it was, and ships could come in and bring us fresh water whenever they arrived. As you can see, even today there's water in what was part of Drake's leat. You can see this moor on the moors after a heavy rain. You get water in the leat, it gives you an idea. And this goes straight down to the Barbican. All the conduits that were put up were connected with this waterway.
So Mr. Weeks could not have picked a better place.
No.
He had the supply of water and open space.
And come downhill to bring his supplies down.
I've come back to the Barbican today to meet Laura Quigley, a local author who has made a study of the events that centred around the Weeks family in the summer of 1675. Hi Laura.
Hi Steve, how are
Spring
you?
day in Plymouth. I'm well. It's a spring day in Plymouth, isn't it?
It is.
And it's misty.
It is very misty. It's beautiful.
Drizzly.
Though. It is a beautiful backdrop here. It just is such a gorgeous harbour.
Laura,
really
tell me
is.
what happened.
Well, August 1675, William Weeks and their family, they came back from church to have their Sunday lunch. The meat wasn't ready. The servants were still preparing their meal. So William Weeks and his wife decided they'd have a little bit of pottage, which is a kind of savoury soup, a savoury broth, while they're waiting for their meat. So they have the little bit of pottage, and William Weeks tastes a little bit of his beer and says, the beer tastes funny. And he hands that to his daughter, and she thinks it tastes a bit funny as well. Now obviously you don't want to contaminate anything, and so they're quite worried about this, but they eat the pottage instead. The baby's there with them, we think probably about a year old, and the baby's being looked after by a nurse called Philippa Carey, while the meal is being prepared by Anne Evans in the kitchen. Mrs. Weeks finishes her pottage and is suddenly violently ill. She's taken to her bed. Within 24 hours she's dead. The daughter, equally ill, the whole family not well. William Weeks recovers faster than the others, but within about a month, his daughter is dead as well. Now, the surgeon is brought, investigators come along, and it's discovered that there's something in the pottage, a yellow substance that shouldn't really be there, and it's identified as ratsbane. It's a very common use of a common poison at the time, but it was a controlled substance. And so the investigators would discover that Philippa Carey, the nurse, had purchased the ratsbane, this arsenic, in a local apothecary. She had to sign for it, so her name was on that list. And so Anne Evans and Philippa Carey were found guilty of poisoning the Weeks family. Now the Weeks were quite a well-established family. They were a family of they ran a dyeing company about where Drake Circus is now. Actually, is where they lived. And so they had quite a lot of money. They were, and William Weeks was a Lord Mayor of Plymouth. He'd just finished as Lord Mayor, and he was now a Justice of the Peace. And he was the one, remarkably, you think of today's fair trial. Well, he was the one actually who sat in judgment upon Anne Evans and Philippa Carey for killing his family. So you can imagine there's a bit of a conflict of interest there.
Oh my God.
He's the Justice of the Peace, he and a few others, but obviously his involvement is like, well, he's actually investigating the deaths of his own family, and must be a very emotive situation. They brought in a scribe, a chap called John Quick. He was a Puritan minister. He supported the early investigations, doing all the writing of it, and he published a book about this in 1676, which is one of the things that's remarkable is because it's so recent to the events. It's absolutely extraordinary that he wrote this at the time, and it is actually his writings from all the original questioning, and so it's a remarkable piece of work. Obviously, though, he's coming at it from a Puritan point of view, from the idea of a nonconformist preacher. He's looking at Plymouth in the midst of a huge moral dilemma. There's sleaze, there's corruption, there's crime. He's seeing violence on the streets all the time. 1675 was not a great year for Plymouth, but they built the citadel up behind us here. They're obviously supporting King Charles II, but though there were rumours that he'd built the citadel to sort of control the people of Plymouth since the Civil War, but I don't personally believe that. But you can imagine you've got this massive citadel here, but there's crime all around the area, and John Quick is worried that there is a moral decline in the town, and the servants poisoning their masters is a huge example of that. And so he interrogated the girls while they were in the prison at the Guildhall, which is about where at the back of Palace Court, where the Plymouth College of Art buildings were there. Top of the hill, they had a Guildhall that would have had cells beneath it, and so the girls would have been kept there. And he interrogated the girls, and he did a kind of, it's something you see on television. They kind of set one witness off against each other. They set the girls off against each other. And basically they damned each other, they blamed each other, and in blaming each other, they got each other executed. He was very adamant that he wasn't there to kind of force them into a confession. He was there to save their souls.
Of course.
And he felt that executing them, if they could admit their fault, he could save their souls. And the prospect of burning was a good part of that saving Anne Evans' soul. In Easter 1676, Anne Evans was burned at the stake. Beside her, Philippa Carey watched her servant friend be burned, and Philippa Carey was then hanged. Why would they do that in 1676? Now, it's an interesting thing. They didn't burn people very often in England. The only way they would burn someone was for treason. Even witchcraft was hanged in England. Murder was hanged in England. It wasn't an offence that you would burn someone for. Now the poor girls had been, whether you believe they were innocent or not, they were certainly condemned to be hanged and Anne Evans burned. But the idea was that William Weeks really wanted to have a public spectacle. He wanted to show that the town that you couldn't do this to his family. But there was a bit more of a context to this. In 1675, there was a huge uprisings in the New World, in New England. The native peoples really rose up against the English settlers, and it was a very long war, and it was a very bloodthirsty war. And so they wanted to show that you couldn't have the servants, the slaves, the inferiors rising up against their masters. It was a very, very dangerous precedent if a servant would get away with killing her master and the master's family. It upset the laws of the land, the circumstances in which the whole society was organised. And so it was very important to them to show that this girl had committed treason, and they wanted that spectacle of burning. And so they took her from the Guildhall. They tried them in Exeter, brought them back from Exeter. It was a long haul back from Exeter. And they deliberately wanted them executed in Plymouth, which is a rare thing. Most executions happened in Exeter. Again, so they had burnings in Exeter for treason, but not in Plymouth before. But they wanted to bring this girl back here to show the townspeople the order of things and what happened if you committed treason against your masters. It was very, very important to them. For John Quick, as a Puritan minister, it was important to show that the girls were being saved by having their souls redeemed through the process of burning. It's a bit of an archaic idea, but the Puritans were a pretty archaic people sometimes, very Old Testament in their ways. And so they wanted the spectacle of burning this girl. The trial at Exeter Assize seems to have just confirmed what William Weeks wanted to happen. They agreed that William Weeks would do this, and they deliberately chose Easter as a period where people would be around, and it became a holy spectacle of burning this girl on the hoe, on the highest point of the hoe anyway. I know Saving Bearing Gold, I think, later talks about it being at Prince Rock, but I know that there's discussion about where the burning actually was held, because Prince Rock is actually quite a distance from here.
For me, it's obviously on the hill right in front of us.
I would suspect so, because
you wouldn't see Prince Rock from here.
They talk about everybody lining the citadel and the harbour.
That's up there, isn't it?
To watch the spectacle it is, and so I would have thought over there would be a sort of prime area, and there was a gibbet actually over that area from the early days,
right.
Wasn't there? I've seen that on maps anyway.
And
so,
there are stories of 20,000 or 10,000 people up on Lambay Hill.
Yes.
Colossal.
It would have been a huge spectacle. It would have been a big deal in the day. It would have been seriously. They'd had quite a lot of time to prepare, and it was a huge sort of procession of taking Anne Evans on a cart, on a small, like, what's the word? A tray.
Hurdle.
A hurdle cut. That's it. And literally dragging her from the Guildhall on her back, clutching a Bible, and taking her to the place of execution.
Even today, the change in elevation is very obvious, and we can see why this was a good spot. The original records say on the high ground in Cap Down, actually it says Prince Rock, but that was a name that applied to this area as a whole. And you can see the ground is elevating. I'm pretty much sure this would be the site of the executions. The ground still rises. You'd have had a ringside seat here. You can easily see here how the crowds on Lambay Hill would have had a fantastic view.
So Easter's 1676. Anne Evans and Philippa Carey are in the Guildhall prison. They're drawn from the Guildhall over to the place of execution. There's huge crowds around them. This is a huge spectacle. It's a big event for the town. They haven't had an execution here for a while, and this is going to be particularly brutal. So obviously it attracts everybody from, I would say most of South Devon would have come to see this. The poor girl Anne Evans was carried on a hurdle, like a tray dragged behind a horse, and she's lying there with her Bible, clutching her Bible. She's taken to the place of execution and tied to the stake on a pile of wood. Philippa Carey is taken to the place of execution and is stood on a ladder nearby, within sight of Anne Evans, with a hangman's noose in front of her. Philippa Carey is forced to watch as Anne Evans is burned at the stake. The crowd, as they see the wood being lit, the crowd declare that they want mercy for the girl. This girl's 14 at this stage. They want mercy for the child, and so the executioner strangles Anne Evans and kicks a block out from under her feet, which strangles her on the stake. And so at the time of actually
Is that
burning,
because there's a rope around her neck?
there's a rope around her neck it pulls her down to strangle her. So there's a rope around her neck. She dies at the stake, and then they burn her body at the stake. Meanwhile, Philippa Carey is standing there for the whole spectacle. It must have been hours, stood there watching her colleague, co-conspirator, if you take the trial to be the truth, watching that girl burn. The crowd are singing psalms. This crowd are it's seen as almost as a religious spectacle as much as an execution. When it comes to hanging Philippa Carey, however, we have a problem. There's no executioner to be found.
So the hangman's missing.
The hangman has disappeared. Philippa Carey stood there on a ladder with a noose. There's the burning ashes from Anne Evans' execution, and there's no hangman to be found. The original hangman just couldn't cope at all anymore and is found drunk and under a bridge somewhere. So they have to get a second executioner to actually kill Philippa Carey. Her last words are, well, unrepeatable. She practically swears at the audience. She's been swearing at everybody, declaring her innocence all the way through the entire catastrophe of a trial and execution. And she, even to the end, she declares she's innocent. There is a hint that perhaps her husband had something to do with it. Nobody ever talks about Richard Carey. Some say she was a widow. Actually, he was still around, but he may have even been at the house at the time of the poisoning, but he's certainly long gone and disappeared and left her to it. But she died declaring her innocence, which was very disappointing to John Quick, because he really wanted to save her soul, and now he thinks that she's actually going to burn in hell because she has not declared her guilt and accepted her penance, as it were. But it's a fascinating book in that it is a moral tale in order to tell everybody how the servants should behave, how people should keep their place, the consequences of even thinking that you could harm your masters. And it is about controlling the population and re-establishing the rightful order of things, which led to the death of two possibly innocent girls in Plymouth.
Contemporary reports say to us that the hangman, who had absconded, drunk, was found hiding on the beach here. It's still a beach. Apparently he had the hangman's noose still in his hand. I now need to meet another person to get a different perspective on this story. I've just come down Lambay Hill, overlooking Sutton Harbour, to meet Andrew Jago, who is a local Plymouth historian, researcher and blogger who has made an in-depth study in this most intriguing and unusual Plymouth event. Hello, Andrew.
Hi, Steve. How are you?
Very well. Have a seat in the best seat in the house.
Oh, thank you.
Because this would have been the best view, wouldn't it?
It certainly would, Steve. Yeah. The best we can do is suggest that the place of execution was more or less where the National Marine Aquarium now stands. This whole area would have been absolutely thronged with people. Estimates up to 20,000 people around the Citadel, Lambay Hill, around the Catwater, Catdown. And it was a massive event, the first burning execution in Plymouth. Treated almost as if it was the fireworks competition.
What do you think the atmosphere was like?
I think it would have been one of excitement and almost frivolity. I think there was some kind of sympathy with Anne Evans, but Philippa Carey by this point had been so demonised by all the the commotion and everything that had been said and written about her, that she would have probably really drawn the ire of the crowd, and she did. And there's a piece in John Quick's book that suggests, she gave as good as she's got as she was paraded through.
Who's John Quick?
John Quick was he was a Puritan minister, and he spent the previous sort of months really going to town on Anne Evans and Philippa Carey whilst they were in prison, both here in the Guildhall jail and when they were incarcerated at Exeter Castle. And he wrote pretty much the source material for which we know this story from. There's been one or two other things, but he wrote really from the day of the crime right up until the day of the execution. So his story is pretty much the only contemporary source material we've got for that day.
Let's look at Anne's execution. What really went on? Because there are two different aspects to this, possibly, maybe three or four even.
Right, so according to John Quick, Anne's brought to this place on a hurdle, which is kind of like a wicker sledge.
And it's just dragged, isn't it?
Just dragged. And then she's attached to the stake, Quick says, by an iron hoop. And then what happens is, obviously, the sermons and everybody's trying to get her to confess their sins and see the light of God and etc. Once all that's out of the way, the executioner then comes along, and he's already had this fire built up. There's gorse and wood and all sorts. Unfortunately, when the time comes to try and light the fire, the Plymouth weather intervened probably and made everything wet.
As usual.
As usual. And so it took him, the executioner, something in the region of 15 minutes to try and get this fire started, by which time the assembled crowds were all getting a little bit twitchy. And in the end, well, there's two different sort of variations. One says that the stock was kicked away and was then
That's from under her feet.
Kicked from under her feet, and she was hung that way
Because she had a rope around her neck.
because she had also had a rope around her neck.
Yeah.
Yes. And the other option is, and probably a bit slightly more realistic, since we know that she was attached to the stake with an iron hoop, it's unlikely she would have fallen far enough for her to have hung from that position. So there's possibly, we're looking at either a hole at the back of the stake where the executioner could put his hands through and strangle her manually, or use the ends of the rope to,
Pull back on her.
garrote her, basically.
Yeah.
Anyway, that whichever way that was done. And then, well, eventually they did get the fire started, but by then Anne was already dead, probably for an hour or so from the executioner's hands.
Some reports say that Anne confessed at the stake. Others say she pleaded her innocence. But your research tends to point to the fact that she confessed.
She did, and I think she was really put under an awful lot of pressure while she spent her time at the jail, both in Plymouth and in Exeter. She was visited by all manner of people, the church people, John Quick especially. He was there pretty much every week, probably a couple of times a week, pressurising her. And in the end, her statements become ever more fantastical. So initially she pleads innocence, doesn't know anything about it. But by the time John Quick's finished with her months later, she's held her hands up pretty much through everything, and said she was pretty much forced to do it by Philippa Carey.
Her ashes were
Yeah,
offered to
absolutely
the,
right.
to the
So
family.
because she'd finally confessed her sins, the local law makers and the borough of the town, from the goodness of their heart, I should say, did suggest that any family members that were around, well, we don't know, she was an orphan, so we don't know if there was any family members, but if there were, they were welcome to come and collect her ashes and bury them in consecrated ground if they wanted to.
So Plymouth is a kind place.
It is, yeah.
We're here on the beach, and there's a report of the disappearing hangman. What is that all about?
So we've got this story that once the executioner had failed to get the fire started and had then dispatched Anne Evans, he then disappeared and no one could find him. There's a suggestion that he was found on this beach, the worse for wear for drink, perhaps just overcome by some sort of guilt. He went and got himself absolutely mindless drunk, and he was found here. He was taken back to the site of the execution, where he promptly fell asleep in front of the scaffold, for want of a better word, where Philippa Carey was waiting for her doom. Now there's a suggestion that a lot of this was actually faked, that there was some sort of collusion between Philippa and her executioner. Some suggesting that there was some kind of relationship between the two, and that he was going to make himself sort of unavailable to carry out the execution. The execution would be stayed, and then at some point in the future, Philippa and the executioner could then go off into the sunset and live their lives. Obviously that did not happen. Probably somebody, another kind Plymouthian in the crowd, offered his services as a makeshift executioner, and was quite happy to take a few shillings to turn off Philippa Carey as she was waiting on her ladder. The term turn off, so turning the ladder so that she then dropped, and yep, she hung. There was no happy ending for Philippa either.
What strikes a chord with me, though, is that these rocks here today would have been here then. In fact, the hangman could have sat on them, unchanged, not even by more than a fraction of an inch. Amazing. History just stands still, doesn't it? So just how easy would it be to find a person in the crowd who was okay to kill a very young girl? I mean, to my mind today, it's beyond comprehension.
I think at this point, Plymouth was sort of a Puritan town anyway, as we know, but the religious fervour of the Puritan ministers, particularly people like John Quick, William Jennings, who was a former mayor, also a JP, and probably William Weeks himself, they had probably whipped the crowd up into a frenzy as far as Philippa Carey was concerned anyway. She was vilified as a whore and a devil and a demon and all this sort of stuff. So probably in the crowd there would have been someone of equally sort of religious fanaticism that would have quite happily offered a service and taken a bonus of a couple of shillings or so to do the deed. I don't think it would have been difficult at all.
Because there was a feeling they were going to save her soul.
Exactly that. I think, and not so much save her soul, cast her into hell, I think, is probably more likely.
right,
You know, I mean,
yes.
it wasn't so much about saving her soul as casting this evil sinner, this murderer, into the depths of hell, I think, as much as anything, because she obviously, Philippa Carey, she protested her innocence really from day one and right up until the last. She never wavered from that fact. She never confessed to anything. So this was an even bigger sin in their eyes. That, you know, not only was she committed this deed, she was not owning up to it.
So it looks like that Anne confessed,
Anne confessed,
but Philippa protested her innocence
until the
to
last.
the end.
Yes.
Which meant it was harder to save her soul.
Yeah. So they would have been, they were casting her into hell. That was, I'm sure, the way they would have thought about it. Yeah.
What really affects me is that it probably happened within a few 100 feet of where we are today.
It's incredible that you've managed to get this location pretty much exactly right, I think, Steve.
And all the people would be just over there.
They would just be all over there. Imagine those streets absolutely thronged with people. There would have probably been people selling song sheets and pamphlets, and there would have been preachers going around trying to save everybody from the devil. It's just incredible to even try and imagine it.
You can just see Teats Hill House, the roof of it. This would have been here during the execution. You have to wonder, what did they see and hear from inside their house? I'm now going to ask Andrew about the possibility of a conspiracy that went on in this most confusing event, with different stories told different things. Andrew, it seems it's not as obvious as it is. It's complicated, isn't it?
It's very complicated, Steve. So what we have is the motive that's given for Philippa Carey wanting to do away with her mistress Elizabeth Weeks, was because there was some kind of animosity between the two, which sort of came from the suggestions or whispers, if you like, that there was some kind of intimate relationship between Philippa and her husband, Mr. William Weeks. Unfortunately, there's no way of proving either way, but it certainly gives food for thought when you think of how quickly the two girls were accused, and then with Mr. William Weeks himself pretty much acting as a prosecution against them. The girls didn't have any defence as such. The only sort of defence they ever had was the preachers trying to preach them into admission, which in Philippa Carey's case was sort of unsuccessful anyway. But yeah, so we have William Weeks surrounded by his friends, the former mayor William Jennings, who was actually removed from his position as mayor some 10-13 years earlier because he was a non-conformist in his religion. So basically he was a Puritan, but at a time when that wasn't tolerated. And so we can see a connection between Jennings and John Quick, and presumably William Weeks forming this kind of plot, perhaps, to do away with anybody who might be sort of an awkward or unwanted presence. I think perhaps Anne Evans was caught up in the crossfire of all this, and being such a young girl, she was too easily suggestible, and in the end she put her hand up to all sorts of things that she probably never did at all. So yeah, there's a suggestion. So this is where Philippa Carey is called a whore by Mrs. Weeks, and then resultingly in the general population of the town at the time. And then we also have this other incident which involved William Weeks and Philippa Carey's brother. Now, he was executed in April of 1676 in just outside Bodmin, a gallows field. It was at Blisland, and before he was executed, he confessed a whole raft of thefts up and down Devon and Cornwall, and in fact he even confessed to selling his wife to a miller at one point. But one of the thefts involved an amount of material, I think it was serge, from Mr. William Weeks himself. So there's another kind of a bit of a vengeance going on there, I think, perhaps. And there's also a question now of John Codmore, who was Philippa's brother, having secreted away an amount of cash in Loo, actually, which is where Philippa's husband then rode down to get this purse full of gold and bring it back for Philippa, which she hid apparently somewhere. And so, yeah, there's lots of things to be suspicious about, shall we say? Certainly from William Weeks, who was basically in control of this whole scenario right from the off. Nothing was done without him seeing to it. And I'm not sure if he was actually the mayor at the time, but he was certainly mayor.
He had been the mayor,
in 1675. So I think his term of
Ended,
had ended by this point. But I think during the investigation period of it, he was the mayor, was he not? I think
so, yeah.
So
He was justice of the peace afterwards, wasn't he?
justice of the peace, yeah. And like his friend William Jennings. So yeah, there's certainly the ingredients for a conspiracy there, whether you would believe that or not. I think it's probably unlikely that Anne Evans was ever involved in any of this, and I'm not so sure about Philippa Carey. I think possibly there may have been some kind of conspiracy where she's involved, but whether she actually did the deed that she was accused of, I think is...
We'll never know.
You will never know, no.
We will never know what happened, but there were victims. The victims who were killed by arsenic, the Weeks family, and Anne and Philippa were also victims. Were Anne and Philippa victims of a society run by men, in which the easiest people to blame were women? I've caught up with Phil again, and he has some final thoughts on this subject.
I've not seen anything to do with the court case, but it seems very odd that two girls working in the same household would plot to kill the family, and the woman went to get rat poison a short time before. She'd have had to sign for this poison, because as we said, it's a controlled substance. But the owner of the house must have given her permission and money to go and get this poison. The other odd thing about this case is, what do these women gain from killing the family? Their employers. They'd be out of work. They're not going to gain anything. There was nothing left to them. So what is the gain? Unless they hated them, but then why stay in their service? It's a very odd case. Very odd.
Upon arrival home, my mind went back to the 1970s and an article in the Western Evening Herald, and that's when it was called the Western Evening Herald, not the Evening Herald. The article was about a redevelopment at Capdown, and once the land had been cleared of whatever was on it, it was scraped. I believe scraping is the term that is used to remove the debris, rubbish, stones, whatever there could be. It was scraped, and when it was scraped, a large patch of burnt wood and ash was found in the ground. And at the time, the query was, could this possibly be the remains of the burning girl of Cat Down of 1676.